Hey everyone, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. This is grade 3 and it's lecture 7 today. We're on to the topic of triple barreling. We're also going to touch on bluffing EV again, which of course, as you'll know, is the difference between the EV of bluffing and checking instead. So whenever this is positive, we need to bluff. We have a mandatory bluff. When it's neutral, we have an optional bluff on the river. And when it is negative, we're going to have to give up with our hand. To reach a triple barrel spot, our ranges become significantly polarized and our opponent's range heavily condensed. For example, in this cutoff versus button 3-bet pot, where button bets 1/3 pot on the flop, 60% on the turn, using the smaller sizing there because the stack to pot ratio is a bit smaller than in a single raise pot, so that's why we're not using B75, and then B117 is effectively just jamming the rest on the river. Don't worry about the fact that button is left in overbet here. It's not particularly important whether button leaves 80% pot, 100% pot, 117. Who cares? Sometimes you hear people bang on about geometric sizing. You know, you've got to bet geometrically. It's not even the right use of the word, for one, but secondly, you don't. You can do this however you want to, as long as you're not making an absurdly big or small sizing on one street for no reason. So 60 and then 117. Totally fine. So on this blank river, we, the aggressor, button in this case, will tend to arrive with a large range disadvantage, RD, meaning our equity is going to be way behind that of our opponent. But our large nut advantage is going to compensate for that because we are the one who has the monopoly on hands that are entitled to way more than the pot. We obviously have the unique combos of aces, kings, queens, etc. that cutoff would be 4-betting, jacks in this case as well. Jacks wouldn't be a 4-bet in earlier position necessarily, but in cutoff it's going to be pretty much always. This monopoly that we hold on those hands allows us to just want to empty the clip here, following the teachings of glutton theorem that we looked at last time in lecture 6. We want to just shove everything on the river whenever we're betting here. We're not really going to have many hands that fall in the equity bracket that allows them to bet but not shove, because shove is only 117% pot anyway. Betting 75% pot is just something we would do with a hand that maybe only has 76% equity instead of 84, like that kind of thing. But we don't really have any hands of that nature that we need to bet. If we have got here with some weak 10, we can check back at this point possibly. These worlds are usually slightly unfavourable overall because the condensed range of our opponent likes the blank runout, and the large equity disadvantage that our range has here tends to trump the nut advantage that we have. If there was more money left behind, that would be different. A nut advantage gets better and better as the SPR is larger, so if we had 4x here that we could jam here, we could offset that equity disadvantage by our nuts being entitled to way more of the pot. Here we see the Range Explorer graph where button's equity is 39.6%, but their EV is redeemed somewhat by the nut advantage. The main differences between the two ranges here are, firstly, well, button has a lot of combos that are just absolutely nothing. Down at the bottom here, this is the bluff region. Out of position, the cutoff player doesn't really have many of these because they've condensed multiple times. Note that out of position doesn't really get to call showdown valueless draws on the turn to B60. They can call draws that have some showdown value, like the king queen of diamonds or ace jack of diamonds, but they can't just be peeling here with 7-8. Our tier 1 region is going to look like this, and these hands are overall just strong enough to use the biggest sizing available, the shove for 117% pot. We can note here that in the out of position player's range, we actually have some hands that have higher EV than any of the hands in our range. This is interesting because you would wonder, well, does button not also have 10s and 9s? Surely these sets, or boats as they are in this case on the paired turn, are shared. They are shared. But the thing is that when you have an aggressive opponent who's got a polarized range and is barreling into you frequently on the river, you actually have higher EV with your sets than they do with theirs. The idea is that when cutoff has a set here, they can make money from both our value hands and our bluffs, whereas we can only make money from the stronger hands in our opponent's range when we shove. It's actually even better to have the set here as cutoff because you're going to unblock all of button's overpairs, whereas when button has a set, they're mainly just going to block cutoff's calling range. So cutoff's boats are higher EV than button's boats. Even though they're the same hand, they're playing against different ranges. Our tier 4 hands are fairly abundant here as well. These are hands that were barreling for whatever reason and now have a bit of showdown value. We can see that cutoff's range is not many combos in general by this point because they would have jammed turn or raised flop or folded by now with a lot of their hands, and they didn't have as many combos as we did pre-flop. But we can see that we have quite a density here of hands that were formerly able to value bet, like some kind of 10, which are now just going to be checking back, coming in at around 50, 60, 65% equity, that sort of thing. Their EV may be a bit higher than that, it depends. Being in position and being able to close the action gives you a very good conversion rate of EV from your equity. But yeah, these hands are not going to be strong enough to value bet. Then we have the main feature of today's topic, which is the bluffing tiers. If you recall from grade 2, we introduced these as tiers 5 through 7, everything that was below tier 4, i.e. below a hand that's got enough showdown value to check. These hands can check though, because this is not a favourable world, many of them will give up, and the tier 7 ones will just be pure give ups because they're going to be negative in terms of bluffing EV, meaning that the EV of bluffing is worse than that of checking. Let's plot the bluffing tiers in a bit more specificity now. So if we zoom in to the bluffing tier hands that are betting, we can divide the air region into 3 subgroups. Firstly, we have tier 5, which are slightly winning bluffs. The reason these are slightly winning is that they have positive blocker effects, but because we're not in a favourable world for range, where fold equity is inherently really high, these hands aren't going to yield enough fold equity to be considered amazing. Against someone who's under folding the river, actually, these are going to be losing as well. But the idea is that in a completely balanced GTO situation, the blocker properties of these hands just make them slightly winning. But we have seen from looking at data and equity in general that hands don't get a massive equity or fold equity boost just from blockers in most spots. Typically you're looking at about a 3 or 4% fold equity swing at the most. So obviously some exploitative factors can offset this and mean that you still don't want to bluff with tier 5. Tier 6 are going to be your break-even bluffs. They're going to have a neutral mix of Y factor. They're not going to block too many folds, but nor are they going to unblock too many either. These hands are typically okay to bluff with. You should do it sometimes in order to make sure that your value hands get paid off and maintain a relatively reasonable level of aggression. This doesn't have to be perfect in the real world, but you don't want to be obviously and massively unbalanced by always or never bluffing tier 6. With tier 7, these are losing bluffs. They have negative bluffing EV in equilibrium and therefore they must check. Given that they're only going to be losing a little bit of money because blockers can never have a tremendous effect on EV in a spot like this, we would soon start bluffing these against someone that was too tight, and indeed a lot of populations do overfold 3-bit pots on this sort of texture, as we'll talk about in a minute. This is the overall graph here, and we can see that we've now began to differentiate between the few types of bluff that we can have here. Our tier 7 bluffs are losing. They're microscopically worse to bluff with than tier 6. The reason that they appear to be the same EV on this graph is that they're not bluffing, and so they're basically just accepting an EV of 0. Tier 6, in the meanwhile, will be bluffing sometimes, but when they bluff, their EV is also 0 there. While tier 6 and tier 7 look like they have the same EV, they are choosing different actions. Tier 6 is mixing bluff and breaking even, and tier 7 is never mixing bluff but breaking even by giving up. Giving up is break even if it feels worse to you to never win the pot. Tier 5, these bluffs are winning. You can see that the line starts to creep up microscopically here. There's not a big deal. Again, we're looking at EV in quarters here of 50, 100, 150% pot, that sort of thing. So it's not really going to be very visible when we creep up from having 0% pot to 3% pot, but that is indeed what's happening here. As we start to see a more acute climb in EV, that's because we're moving into the tier 4 hands of the in-position player, the button 3-better's range on this Rivel triple barrel opportunity spot. Let's tier our bluff candidates now by imagining villain's range. Remember, we're going to look for hands that have positive bluffing EV, that's our tier 5 hands, and these are hands where the EV of bet is better than the EV of check. In other words, bluffing EV is the difference between betting and checking. In such relatively neutral worlds, we will usually have 3 types of air hand, as we've noted: tier 5, which are slightly winning, tier 6, which are break even, and tier 7, which are losing. And while I keep stressing that these do not trump exploitative considerations, the better you get at this, the more your win rate will creep up in the long term by your general accuracy with bluff selection improving. As we can see, tier 6 break even, and otherwise we're going to lose or win money depending how good our blockers are. Here is an example of a tier 5 hand. We have a hand like Queen Jack of Hearts. Let's talk about X Factor first of all, which we've introduced in previous lectures as the ability to remove villains' calling range. We can do this to a reasonable extent with this hand because Queen 10 and Jack 10 appear to be hands that our foe could be folding. Therefore, in a game where the blinds are 5-10, we can see that the EV, not in percentage pot here but in chips, is 1.68 big blinds to bet here. 16.68 chips in a 5-10 game is between 1 and 2 big blinds. That's quite a lot of money, because if you imagine just posting a big blind and then folding and then doing it again, that's kind of what you're doing here almost with this hand if you get this wrong and give up. The clues here are that you unblock diamonds, you unblock really big cards that are maybe calling turn but now folding, and the jack is just not going to block any folds here really, it's just going to block jack 10 of hearts, the queen will block maybe some folds if cutoff ever gets here with some ace queen off with a diamond or something, but for the most part cutoff's range will be unblocked, the folding region of it that is, will be unblocked by this hand, and so we can say that the Y factor for this hand is reasonable and the X factor is positive, therefore we have a winning bluff. This is the formula for trying to ascertain in game whether your bluff is likely to be winning baseline, losing baseline, or breaking even by default, is thinking about positive and negative removal, known as X factor and Y factor, respectively, in the Carrot Poker skill. King of Clubs, Jack of Diamonds. This is a hand that begins to have some negative blocker property because Ace Jack of Diamonds is a hand that villain is going to be folding now. However, the King of Clubs is a very useful card, you're still blocking the King 10 suited, which is going to be one of villain's most prevalent calls, I believe, and so this hand is an okay hand to bluff. You'll note here that while the solver is choosing to bet this hand all of the time, it's not doing that because it thinks it's positive. This is a break-even hand to bluff. You can see the negligibly small difference here between checking and going all in. You don't want to bet 1/3 pot, that would be a blunder, but otherwise this is fine. What's really happening here is that the solver is trying to just apply pressure long term with its strategy. Applying pressure per se and putting villain into a tough spot. You hear this kind of rhetoric sometimes from poker annotators and coaches, and it doesn't really mean anything. Like, sure, giving your opponent a problem to solve can be better just by default than not giving them a problem to solve, but the main idea here is that your value hands need to be paid, and of course this solver's algorithm is running the spot trillions of times against itself. And what it's found to reach this pseudo-Nash equilibrium that we're in is that if it actually stops bluffing this hand and just says, oh well, it's break even, so why should I bother bluffing? What will happen is that the opponent can start pitching lots and lots of value hands. On the other hand, if we were to go the full mile and actually bluff this all of the time instead of 97% of the time or whatever it's choosing to bluff there, we would also see like some kind of exploit where the opponent starts calling bluff catchers more and then the EV of bluffing the Queen Jack of Hearts goes down slightly or something. But who cares? That's a tiny sliver of check that's going on here, but there will be other hands that are tier 6. That's to say they're break-even bluffs by default and they're mixing a bit closer to 50-50 or something. And when you choose to always bet with those hands, you're going to actually overbluff and ruin the EV in theory of all of your bluffs because now your opponent can just switch to always calling their own bluff catchers. But that's not a problem in reality because people don't know that we're overbluffing necessarily unless you're me, in which case they just always call you. King Jack of Diamonds, this is a hand that strikingly has very bad blockers and unsurprisingly is losing a whole big blind pretty much to bluff this holding. You can recognize this very easily by just saying we block busted flush draws like King Queen and Queen Jack, and maybe not Queen Jack, I think that shoves turn, but King Jack of Diamonds, Ace Jack of Diamonds, these ones are going to call turn sometimes, and when we block them we just remove folds so we get called more often. Basically villain has more bluff catchers like the King 10 of clubs when we hold the King and Jack of Diamonds. That's a very basic outline of how to identify these tiers. What gives these hands their respecting bluffing EVs, and can we trust them in the real world, is a question that we should be asking. We have to remember that the solver's confrontation against itself in such spots can become quite meta, meaning that the solver can react to blockers in its opponent's strategy, which can then cause a reaction in the original player's strategy with blockers to those blockers, and it can all become very convoluted, meta, and borderline meaningless for humans. This is not a spot where I think this output is in any way dicey or dependent on strange solver phenomena, but I think we should talk about why, because there will be spots where the solver strongly prefers, in frequency terms, maybe not EV terms, but frequency wise it really prefers bluffing with one hand and not another, but that's actually just based on some very novel thing that its solver opponent is doing in relation to its own strategy in the first place. It gets a bit convoluted quite quickly. Let's do a human control check on this solver output and make sure that we're actually happy to adopt it. To understand how to interpret the equilibrium conclusion, that's the output that the sim spits out, and to understand where a hand has a positive, neutral, or negative bluffing EV, there are two key questions which we would like to ask. Firstly, why does the solver think this in the first place? And secondly, can I trust it? Do I believe that the set of conditions in my own landscape against humans, population, this specific reg, my buddy that I'm sat next to at the live 2-5 table, do I trust that the solver's conclusions apply there? Sometimes you see an amateur 1-2 live poker player studying pile solver on their phone in between hands at the table, and every time I see these kind of funny memes posted of these things, I just kind of crack up a little bit inside because I just can't think for a second that the conditions are anything like what they are in the solver. And so copying solvers mindlessly in games where you should be reacting very exploitatively is a really bad way to go. We need to make sure that we don't want to make big deviations here before we accept the solver's evaluation of our bluffing tiers. To ask why, one thing we can do to come to understand the output better is see what it's derived from. And the thing that outputs are derived from are the other nodes in the tree. That's the node leading up to the node that we're looking at the strategy for, and the node directly following it. When you take X line, you're going to be reacting to the line that villain reached that spot with, so that will be the action sequence that happened before. But you'll also be taking X line based on villain's reaction to X line and what they're going to do on the next node. That's why the immediate past and immediate future are incredibly useful tools for understanding the present in GTO. We're going to explore how our hand, as deemed by the solver as a tier 7, 6 or 5 bluff, actually interacts with our real opponent's folds or calls. Do we trust that it's happening the same way as it is in Equilibrium? We can ignore combos that are being mixed fairly equally in our opponent's strategy when we're doing this exercise, because they will not have a big effect on villain's overall range splitting and which sorts of cards they're folding more often than they're calling, and vice versa. To ascertain whether we can trust these outputs, we want to ask, is it reasonable to expect a competent human to play this way if we're playing in a competent game? But if you're playing 1-2 on a Friday night and everyone's drunk and complete amateurs, maybe you can just accept that things are very different and try to figure out what each individual player is doing. There's always a gradient, there's a sliding scale, which describes how far we want to deviate from GTO, and generally the weaker the players in the game, the more we want to do that. Is this something that humans will exhibit, these behaviors we see in the sim? Or are they simply what we'll call solver phenomena? Solver phenomena are things that are based on specific, complex, or unnatural assumptions about ranges, such as, I see my opponent is favoring a 7 to a 6 here for bluffing the river, and therefore my range is favoring the 6 rather than the 7 for calling based on some extremely hard to spot and very finely grained detailed factor. That's something you'd probably want to reject for most humans in reality, unless you're playing the end boss of all online poker. That's me, by the way. Not really. This sim here, we have the reaction to our shove, and by understanding better how villain is reacting, we can get a sense for what tier 6, tier 5, and tier 7 bluffs look like. For example, here we can see that most of villain's calling range on the river actually contains a 10, and then contains some kind of kicker that is jack through king with that. These are the hands that are calling at the highest frequency. Meanwhile, some hands that are pure folding are things like busted diamonds like ace jack. Ace queen is folding pretty often too, more than the mean, and then these under pairs are folding a lot as well. It would follow from this that if we did reach this river with a hand like ace 8 suited, that hand would be a pretty bad hand to blast off with, because the ace doesn't really have too much positive removal, although it does remove ace 9 and ace 4, but the 8 is going to block a lot of combinations. Why does the solver assign different bluffing EVs to the following hands? We can see why that happens by glancing at the sim. Queen jack has a blocker to queen 10. It's not blocking too many folds. Jack 10 is calling quite a lot as well. It just seems to not have any bad Y factor. It's leaving the folding range alone. It's blocking the calling range, i.e. it's got good X factor. King Jack, we've discussed this one, a little bit of a mixed bag. And then King Jack of diamonds, just mostly negative due to blocking a higher density of the busted flush draw folds. What we'll do here is just compare this in a table format. Here the solver thinks Queen Jack is winning. Do we agree? Well, it says that it's blocking the calls pocket jacks of various suits. I can trust that. I believe that my human opponents will also be calling down on the river here with pocket jacks, therefore I'm not going to reject this solver conclusion and say, Pio, you're crazy, humans will fold jacks here. I don't think they should or will. Jacks is basically almost a value beater. I think we could shove jacks ourselves, so villain cannot fold there theoretically, as we know. Also blocks the high frequency HF here, standing for high frequency. Call Queen of Hearts, 10 of Hearts, which is only one combo. We are talking about like splitting hairs here and fine differences in EV, which is why we need to exploit wherever possible. It's much more important than just following these blocker patterns, but these are great to know as a baseline. I think we can trust this, although I'm a bit less confident on this one. In some games I can see people just saying, oh, I don't want to stack off with top pair or something of this nature, even though it's one of the better bluff catchers in our range. Blocking top set is a good thing to do, or blocking 10-9, a good thing to do when you're calling river. Also, unblocking the pure folds ace queen and ace jack of diamonds. Good Y factor, good thing. Can we trust this? Yes. I strongly believe that humans will also A, reach this node with busted flush draws like these, and B, fold them on the river. As long as we think both of those two things are happening, then we can be confident that this output is just as relevant in reality as it is in the sim. Our tier 6 break-even bluffs now. The solver thinks that these are blocking the pure calls, Jack of Diamonds X. That's why it's also a mixed bag. There's some positive attributes to jacks being blocked here by the Jack of Diamonds. The Jack of Diamonds is a multifunctional card. It's not as bad as the King of Diamonds, because while the King of Diamonds blocks only folds, it only has bad Y factor. The Jack of Diamonds has good X factor, so it massively compensates for it. And we're blocking the high frequency call King 10 of clubs. If we went back to the last slide, you'll see that that hand was calling pretty much always. And I think we can believe that. I think King 10 is a hand that is more likely to call than Queen 10, even though they're basically the same hand in this spot. And blocking pure folds like Ace Jack of Diamonds is a negative, but it's only one combo now instead of two, like the King Jack will block, as we'll see. That blocks more folds. This one again has the positive properties of the Jack, and I believe it. It unblocks high frequency calls like top pair. It does not, however, block the high frequency calls of top pair, so that's more of a neutral thing compared to actually having the positive X factor there, so the X factor is less good. And we're still blocking the pure fold Ace Jack of Diamonds. I think it's even possible that people will reach this node sometimes with the King Queen of Diamonds. I think the solver's pure jamming this on the turn where it has it, or raising on the flop, but I wouldn't be totally surprised if some humans had that hand, and that could render a hand like King Jack of Diamonds an even worse proposition for bluffing. Since all three cases have the same positive blocker property, X factor, of blocking jacks, we can actually ignore this and just focus on the differences between them. When we do this, the picture becomes a lot clearer. What we'd like to do is not just learn really specific things like bluff when you have Queen Jack of Hearts and 10-9-4-4 deuce. How are you ever going to remember that? That's not useful for a human to learn in that way. It's far too specific. So what we want to do is generalize. We want to form rules and form heuristics about how we can actually take some nuggets of wisdom from this spot and have them in such a general form that they can be applied to other spots as well. Rather than just finish our analysis here by accepting the conclusion, a leak that far too many poker players succumb to. I think poker players in general are very guilty, guys, of just looking up a sim, validating their own play or critiquing their own play, looking at an answer like, oh, which hand would bluff here? Okay, it's this one, I'll remember that. You won't remember that if you don't actually give it any meaning. When you're providing a heuristic for a spot based on some evidence from a solver output, you always want to describe it in words and semantics and not just like copy and paste a hand thing into a document and be like, okay, this hand bluffs here. That's useless. Firstly, you want to define the spot in a way that differentiates it from other spots in which our rule would not apply. For example, here we've reached the river very aggressively. Therefore, we think that villain's range has been filtered towards flush draws because he had a reason to stick around with them on the turn. Therefore, blocking flush draws is bad. So we want to say we have reached the river here after aggressive actions or multiple aggressive actions with a very polar range against a very condensed one, and we have a triple barrel opportunity. This is a good metric for understanding this spot. It's not necessary to state in our rule that we're button versus cutoff or that this is a 3-bet pot or anything like that, because the blocker considerations that separate hands between tiers 5, 6, and 7 are actually going to apply in single raise pots as well on many other board textures and in lots of other situations. So you don't want your heuristic to be framed too specifically that you're like, this is a heuristic for 10-9-4-4 deuce cutoff versus button 3-bet pot, because you want your heuristic to be more general than that. In the specific spot that came up, you want to define one or more factors that differentiated the bluffing candidates. Here, what we can say is that the main factors that differentiated our bluffing candidates, and again, these will not use words like diamonds or queen jack because these are board specific, but will be more general. And we'll say that tier 5 bluffs tended to have a positive combination of having the right suits to block top pair. Note that if you have a diamond here, you don't actually block Jack 10 of diamonds because that's impossible. If you have the Queen of Diamonds, the King of Diamonds, you don't block that hand either. So if we got here with a hand like King, Queen of Diamonds, we would see that the X factor was more negative with that hand. Also, a neutral combination of the above factors is what you want to talk about for tier 6 and a negative combination for tier 7. Basically, you want to block the top pair, you want to unblock the high showdown value busted draws, and you want to block the overpair in this case as well, which is jacks, but you can maybe lump both of those together and say you want to block top pair / overpair. Also, when you block top pair, you're also blocking sets if they didn't jam earlier, right? If someone wanted to slow play 10s or 9s there, then you block those hands in their range. Let's test our rule with a different spot now. Any good heuristic that's general enough should hold up in other situations as well. A good rule for applying a GTO solution should be that it's robust enough to survive in many other spots when you change the conditions. Obviously, if you change the conditions in a way that violates the criteria set out for spot identification in your heuristic, then you can't expect your heuristic to apply anymore. If instead of it being a triple barrel node, you were to change and look at a spot where you had a double delayed c-bet opportunity or something of that nature, but what you would find is that it was no longer a bad thing to block busted flush draws. In fact, it'd be a good thing because villains there would no longer be of a flush draw variety for checking all the way to the river. At least not often. That's a useful one. Here we will want to unblock clubs and block the main ace-x combos like ace-queen, ace-jack suited. So we look at this spot, it's blind versus blind, small blind flats the 3-bet pre, and big blind begins tripling off, b33, b60, b87, different sizing now than in the last hand, and b87 is all in. This is because the big blind 3-bet is a bit larger. It's coming in at like 10 BBs, the small blind open was larger, the big blind 3-bet is larger, the pot is bigger, so there's less money left by the river, and again, it's not important for big blind to do this geometrically, as people like to say. I use that word in inverted commas because I don't think it's actually the right word for what they're trying to describe. Interesting situation where when we're bluffing, the ace-x is clearly the thing that's going to be calling, so the main combos of ace-queen and ace-jack suited here are going to be things that don't contain hearts. There'll be some ace-queen off and ace-jack off actually in this spot as well, because it's such a late position battle, so the suitedness won't be such a key factor. However, if we played this spot big blind against hijack or under the gun, or something of that nature in a 3-bet pot, you would see mainly just suited aces calling, offsuit ones preferring to fold or 4-bet preflop. Here we have a very stark split between different bluff candidates. We have Jack 4 of spades, which is actually a really winning bluff, 10-4 which is break even, and the King 7 of clubs which is highly losing. You should be able to have a think about why this is. Maybe pause the video and have a think here. It may not be abundantly clear, but we'll go over it. Okay, I'll assume you've done that. This hand is actually coming in at about 4 big blinds to bluff here. This is a tremendously good hand to bluff. And when you think about it, well, the jack is going to block ace-jack, which actually existed in offsuit format, whereas ace-10 is going to be less useful. Therefore, when you keep everything else constant and just switch between the jack kicker and the 10 kicker, what tends to happen is that you no longer have as good X factor and you just become break even. A lot of villains call down one pair hands here are ace-jack, and that's because ace-jack offsuit gets to flat in this very late position battle. King 7 is losing, but not by a huge amount. It's actually got a little bit of showdown value as well, believe it or not. The reason for this is that blind versus blind is a very tricky and polarized spot pre-flop. The big blind player is going to have a range full of jack high, 10 high, 9 high, hands that they wouldn't really have so much if they were, say, cutoff versus button, like we looked at previously. In these situations then, whenever the big blind player is 3-betting, they very often have just absolute trash, so small blind can actually go check call here with various hands like queen jack of clubs and expect to win against big blind's give-ups pretty frequently. Because big blind's going to give up 10-4, as you can see in the tier 6 region there sometimes, and we're going to win against that with a hand like queen jack or queen 10 suited. King 7 does actually win against some of these lower busted flush draws, which would normally have to play in a different way in reaching this node. If we were against a stronger range here as small blind, that's to say if the big blind was 3-betting more linear perhaps pre-flop, we wouldn't be able to just call turn with a hand like queen 10 of clubs and then show down. Because we can do that in GTO here, the big blind player is actually happy checking King 7, not because it's horrendous to bluff. Actually, this is an okay hand to bluff in this spot apparently, according to the solver, but it's much better to check. Here we can clearly see the influence of the King of Clubs. It does unblock high frequency 1-pair calls while also blocking folds, so it's not a great thing to bluff. I think this 7 is a really good card for removing folds because I don't think the small blind player is going call fold with a 7 ever, so this hand is definitely a mixed bag and fairly close to break even as a bluff, but when you're winning by checking, you've got to check. What about this Jack 4 versus 10-4 dichotomy? Villain always calls ace-jack suited and ace-jack off. These are value beaters, they don't mix at all because they're actually chopping with some of our value bets. We can shove ace-jack here ourselves. But ace-10 is actually just a bluff capture. We don't 3-bet ace-10 pre-flop here, we call all of the combos of ace-10 offsuit and suited. Although you could 3-bet ace-10 suited. So there's a huge difference between having a jack and having a 10 because the jack actually beats value hands when you have ace-jack. Therefore, the small blind player is going to be calling with ace-jack always, but ace-10 isn't really a hand that's being 3-bet by the big blind, so this isn't even a good hand for them to call. This does get a bit meta. Against some humans, you might find that they just always call ace-10 or ace-jack, or they fold both of them, or they treat the two hands equally, and so you can see that in some cases here we may need to take such a solver output with a pinch of salt. We're looking at these differences when ranges get kind of snug like this, the X factor does become more important. I'd say in general the X factor is a bit more important, like blocking your opponent's good hands when you're bluffing in 3-bet and 4-bet pots than it is in single raise pots where all shapes and sizes of top pair are going to be mixing call on the river. Let's move on now and discuss some bluffing tiers in unfavourable worlds where we're going to have to be extra careful and only really the tier 5 hands are going to be surviving as bluffs. On the below runout, Big Blind is actually in a massively awful world for their range, whereas best bluffs are breaking even. This is the sad state of affairs, but when we think about how players reach this spot, it becomes clear why this is the case. Small blind's range in this 3-bet pot for going open, call the 3-bet, check call flop, check call turn, and then check river is very different to Big Blind's range in this situation. Small blind is going to have a lot of heart-heart combos because the main heart combos that are possible when there are 3 broadways out like this, or 2.5, let's call the 9 a semi-broadway here, are going to be something like ace-x. There aren't going to be a whole lot of queen x in their range or Big Blind's range here that are suited, and there's not going to be too many combos of king x, etc. because these are heavily blocked, or 10x, 9x, 7x, these are impossible. So you're going to mainly see hands like ace 4, ace 6, ace 5, ace 8, etc. And Big Blind doesn't actually 3-bet very many combos of these nut flushes because Big Blind is flatting those pre-flop, choosing to build a bit of a more polarized range. Against some players it might be okay to 3-bet ace 6 or ace 8 of hearts here, but that's not something that happens in GTO. Thus when we reach the river, the ranges are pretty lopsided. Big Blind doesn't make many flushes because his pre-flop defense range is loaded with ace-x suited and suited broadways. That's his flatting range, not his 3-bet range. So if they're all going into the flatting range pre, there aren't that many of them in the 3-bet range. Here we have a situation where there are actually no winning combos at all. There are no tier 5 hands, there are just ones that are surviving. You could either view this by saying, okay, tier 6 is now the best we can have, or you could choose to say instead, oh, we have tier 5, but these are now our best ones. It really depends on what appeals to you the most for your framework, but there are no winning bluffs. There are no bluffs that are good because of blockers, just ones that can survive because of blockers. When you have the ace of hearts with an innocuous card, this is a spot that looks amazing for you, but fold equity is lower than normal in this situation because small blind's range is doing so much better than yours here, especially at the top, that actually you don't see a profit even with a hand that looks like a great bluff. That's extremely counterintuitive, but this is what happens when ranges are very unequal. The Jack 5, if you bluff with a terrible hand in a spot that's really bad for your range, what happens is that you just hemorrhage a ton of money. That's right, you're losing 10 big blinds by blasting off with this hand that has terrible Y factor properties, blocking a lot of the Jack 9 suited, Jack 10 suited combos maybe. Maybe not Jack 10 because small blind is out of position, but some folding range hands for sure, and just having absolutely no positive blockers here. I can't think of anything that contains these two cards that small blind would get here with that would be thrilled to call off the river at high frequency. Therefore, this is just a really negative blocker hand. Wet Blanket's rule is that it's a horrific blunder to bluff without very positive blockers on wet and unfavorable runouts. When the runout is both really distinctly wet, meaning there are flushes and straights possible, and it's also really bad for your range, you need to be extremely careful about which blocker properties you use, because if you use the wrong ones, you're going to get completely murdered in these spots based on just having a Stark effect where villain calls with a heart here, folds without a heart. They really do try to block flushes when calling off the rest on the river here. So because they're trying to block flushes, and they're also just calling with flushes because flushes are the nuts, their folding range will be littered with relevant non-heart cards, whereas their calling range will contain relevant heart cards like the Ace of Hearts, the Jack of Hearts, the Queen of Hearts really frequently. A hand like Jack 5 just meddles really strongly with those non-heart, bad bluff catcher, folding region hands. The Y factor properties for Jack 5 of clubs are just hideous. They're really bad. That's Wet Blanket's rule. You do have to be extremely pessimistic on super wet runouts that are bad for you. Not all really wet runouts are bad for you. This one is a bit of an anomaly because we're in a 3-bet pot in a situation where Big Blind just doesn't happen to have that many flushes and Small Blind does based on the preflop range construction. But if you're in a single raise pot, cut off against Big Blind or something like that, usually you're not going to mind a flush runout. In fact, you're going to quite like most runouts that complete draws, particularly ones that complete straight draws, gutters, open-enders, because you're going to barrel turn with these hands, but villain can't necessarily call them out of position. This is very different in this 3-bit pot situation because the ranges pre-flop are very polarized for reaching the flop here, whereas usually ranges are linear and condensed. When you have like a button raiser and a big blind caller, you have 2 linear condensed ranges, but here you have 1 condensed linear range and 1 very polarized one. So extremely different spot that basically gives you a completely different framework to solve. Building rules then finally on wet runouts. This lecture is going to be a little bit shorter than the other ones, but that's okay. Sometimes we need a little bit of a break when we're studying intense poker theory. So let's write up our rule for spots where it's almost impossible for either player to land on the river with air. That's kind of what's going on here. There's basically no way that anyone has many combos of air in this spot. We can say wet, highly unfavorable run out in 3-bet pot. We could say that this is a reasonably correct description of the spot. It's not overly specific, it's not overly vague. We're not going into the fact that there's a king on the turn or there's a 3-flush river. We're just saying it's wet and it's unfavorable. And we can identify all other boards and runouts that fit into this category, therefore, and have a heuristic that's useful across lots of different spots. Tier 5. Nothing should be winning. Nothing should be tier 5 in these spots because fold equity is typically just below the pot odds norm. That means that the best blocker hands just claw back enough fold equity to reach break even. It's a sad state of affairs, but this is what happens in poker. Ranges are not created equally, and they don't remain equal even if they are throughout the course of different action sequences and runouts post-flop. Tier 6 hands, these ones are break even. We have some of these, but this is the best we can do, and the only thing that even gets to be break even in this spot is something that will block hands that complete these nuts on the river. Something like the Ace of Hearts here, something like the Jack of Hearts. Obviously you can't bluff with the King of Hearts in your hand, that's top pair. That would be putting blockers before hand strength, which is absurd. You're going to have some combos here that do qualify as a bluff, but they've got to interfere, they've got to meddle. It's a bit like interference theorem that we talked about earlier in grade 3, where when you're in a spot that's extremely unfavorable, and there it was repolarizing, where you were facing a river bet and you were thinking about raising, that's an unfavorable spot because your opponent's polarized and bet at you and it's expensive for you to continue. This is also an unfavorable spot, but it's more texturally determined than it is by action sequence. Everything else is losing here, some more than others. If your blockers are innocuous, like they don't remove a lot of folds because, let's say, through some freak miracle you reach the spot with the 3 deuce of clubs. I mean, you're not really going to get here with this hand pre-flop, I hope, but if you did get there with that hand, just for an extreme example to make a case in point here, that hand wouldn't be anywhere near as bad to bluff as a hand containing the Jack of Clubs, because the Jack of Clubs is a relevant card that really does get in the way of villains folding region, whereas the 3 and 5 of clubs or the 3 and deuce aren't going to do that so much. So do think about how innocuous / relevant your card is. And remember that we refer to cards that are relevantly meddling with villain's folding range as danglers. They're dangling out there, blocking his cards that are also just dangling and not creating a good hand. And here, even when the Jack is a kicker to a pair, it's going to be a bad card because a pair is bad now. That's what happens on really wet runouts. One pair becomes the bulk of a folding range. That's what you see here. Sorry to be a wet blanket and say that you can barely bluff and you have to be extremely selective and you have to have a heart and blah, 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 but it's true. There's just so many bluff candidates here in the big blinds range that are random suited jacks that aren't hearts and suited queens that aren't jacks. And these are just awful cards to bluff with here. They really are. For homework, I would like you to give some examples of winning tier 5, losing tier 7, and break even tier 6 triple barrels in the following 2 spots. Do this without a solver first and then check your work with the solver as always and see how your conclusions have held up. I like to think that many of you will be in our Discord server and you will be chatting in the Carrot Poker School review channels that you will get into. These will be unique for people who have purchased the course and they'll be available for you to actually discuss the school materials. So I hope you'll get involved there. You'll post your homework exercises and you'll ask for a bit of help if any of this is confusing. Hijacked versus cutoff is the first 3-bet pot, and then the next one is under the gun versus button. The right hand texture there is very bizarre, so have a careful think about how equal or unequal ranges are when you reach that river. Who's the spot better for, and what's that going to mean? How selective will button need to be with their bluffs? I'll see you back here for lecture 8. Only a few lectures to go now before you complete the Carrot Poker School and do the grade 3 exam. Do stay tuned for more courses at carrotcorner.com as well. By the time this is out, there'll be more in the making, so do keep checking back even when you finish the school. Hope you're enjoying it so far. See you in the next lecture, and good luck at the tables. Bye for now, guys.